coincidental, and I think very appropriate, that we are meeting today at JSCS, and Dr. Natan Paradise is our speaker. He is the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Minnesota, where he also serves as director of undergraduate studies. Natan teaches courses in Jewish history and cultures, Jewish American literature, Jewish humor. In addition to his research and writing on the American Jewish experience, antisemitism, and his strategies for advancing DEI that are both effective and truly inclusive. He regularly serves as an invited speaker to local, national, and international audiences on anti-Semitism and DEI. Welcome, Natan. Did you bring a Jewish joke?
Oh, I always have Jewish jokes. Thank you. Do you think I need to use the handheld?
No, we're okay. Yeah.
We're okay? Okay. Well, let me get my tablet up here. Since I'm going to be talking, among other things, about anti-Semitism, there is a joke about anti-Semitism. There was a Jewish guy who, there's always a bully, and the bullies often have other things going on. And this bully was a known anti-Semite, and the Jewish guy saw him coming, and the guy grabs him. And he says, "Hey, why are you Jews so responsible for everything wrong in the world? You know you are, aren't you?" And the guy, he doesn't want to get beat up. He says, "Well, yes, the Jews are responsible, and so are the bicycle riders." And the bully looks at him. He says, "Why the bicycle riders?" And the Jew says, "Why the Jews?" So thank you for inviting me. I called to talk Jewish culture, anti-Semitism, and higher ed. There's a lot to say, and I don't have a lot of time. In fact, I should start my little stopwatch here. I want to start by kind of getting a baseline of knowledge in the room, if I may. Okay? So raise your hand if you primarily think of Jewishness as a religious identity. Do you think of Jewishness as a religious identity primarily? Well, that's the question, right? When you think of Jews, do you think of them as a religious group primarily, or as something else? Okay, so you're primarily religious, okay, and the others aren't sure. Okay, culture, ethnic. Okay, so that's a good baseline. Raise your hand if you're used to thinking of Jews as being mostly white. Okay. I'm now going to give you a range of percentages of the overall American population that you think is Jewish. If you think the Jewish population in America is about 1 to 5% of the overall American population, anybody 1 to 5%? Anybody want to go for 5 to 10%? You're going to do 1 to 5. He's changing his answer. Okay, 5 to 10%, 10 to 15. Okay, anybody want to go 15 to 20? Okay, anybody want to go over 20? Okay, the actual percentage of the American population that is Jewish is 2.4%.
Wow.
Yeah, almost. Yeah, you get a lunch. You get a lunch. Did you get your smoothie? Yeah. Then the question is, why do people always overestimate this? Most people end up guessing 10 to 15%. So I've had some people go as high as 35%. Why do most people get it wrong? Because one of the anti-Semitic myths is that Jews have too much power, that Jews have a lot of power. And if Jews have that much power, there must be more of them. Okay? But in fact, in the US, Jews are 2.4% of the population. The global percentage of the population that's Jewish is about 0.2%. Very, very small. Thinking over the last 50 years, what would you say is the baseline percentage of Americans who are anti-Semitic? judged by the anti-Semitic beliefs they hold about Jews. What would you say is the baseline percentage? Anybody want to throw out a guess?
15.
15? Anybody else? 5? 12 to 15. Historically, it's been, you're on a roll. Yeah, you get, because there's, yeah, yeah. It's been 12 to 15%. It's gone up precipitously since 2016. Okay. Right now, today, about a quarter of the American population ascribes to at least 6 anti-Semitic claims about Jews. That they have too much power, they control the media, they only care about themselves, they're not loyal. There's a whole long list of them. About a quarter of Americans say yes to at least 6 of those, and over half of Americans accept at least one anti-Semitic trope as being true. Okay? Globally, the numbers are much higher. The Anti-Defamation League does a study of, they call it the Global 100. And they ask questions globally, basically, which of these beliefs about Jews do you think are true? And then if they ascribe to enough of them. So in most of the world, the percentage of the population that anti-Semitic ranges from about 25% to 86%. Much of Latin America is in the 40th percentile. Africa, it's often higher than that. The Middle East, 80%. China. The most anti-Semitic places in the world are places where there are no Jews at all. Okay, so this is just about beliefs. It has nothing to do with experience. And those numbers have also gone up globally. Why have they gone up globally? Partly because racism is up nationally and globally, and ethno-nationalism is up, and various nationalist and racist supremacy movements are way up. That is true in the U.S. as well. There are in Minnesota and the surrounding states 3 or 4 white supremacist and white nationalist groups that are very vigorous and have weekly meetings, and they go around the state putting up stickers and doing all sorts of things. And so we are living in troubled times. Okay, so, but who are the Jews, right? What do I mean by Jewishness? Who are these Jews that we're talking about? So, there are biblical origins. And if you subscribe to the biblical story about Jews going back to that first ancestor, Abraham, and his wife, Sarah, um, there's no evidence that Abraham and Sarah existed, but if they did exist, they would have lived around the year 1400 to 1500 before the Common Era. Okay? But there's no evidence for that. There does begin to be archaeological evidence of a distinct group of people living in the Levant, in what is now Israel and Lebanon, in Jordan. And there's archaeological evidence for them as a distinct population with their own cultural practices starting around the year 1200 before the Common Era. And if we want to look at evidence in the surrounding cultures and the surrounding nations that corroborate the existence of these Jewish people and a lot of the stories that appear in the Bible, that corroborating evidence starts to appear around the year 1000 before the Common Era, when we have what we call the Israelites. And there's a group of them living in the north of the region and some in the south. The north was the kingdom of Israel, and the south was the kingdom of Judah. And little teeny tiny kingdoms surrounded by huge empires to the north. The Assyrians, later the Babylonians, and to the south, the Egyptians. You do not want to be the pickle in the middle between those empires, okay? Especially not if you're right on the coast and everybody wants access to the sea. And as a consequence, there were multiple experiences of exile for these people. In 721 before the Common Era, the Assyrians wiped out all of the northern tribes. You know the story of the 10 lost tribes, right? They were the ones in the north. They disappeared. No one knows what happened to them. All that was left were the Jews in Judah, the Judahite. and they were exiled by the Babylonians in 586 before the Common Era. Some of them ended up in Babylonia, what is now Iraq, and some of them ended up in Egypt. And those populations became permanent there. And they're there to this day, although there's only about 40 left in what was their home in Babylonia. Uh, there was another experience of exile in the year 70 of the Common Era when the Romans destroyed the Second Temple. This is not long after the life of Jesus. Uh, and that exile has been permanent. Not everyone was kicked out. Almost the rest of them were kicked out in the year 126 of the Common Era when the remaining Jews again pissed off the Romans. Uh, and so you ended up with a small number of Jews living still in the land of Israel, but most of the Jews now being dispersed increasingly across the globe through North Africa, up through Asia, all the way down to India and China, the Caucasus, Italy, eventually up into Germany and France, and from there to Poland and Russia. A lot of them ended up in Spain. Okay? So you end up with a global people, a transnational people who all have a shared textual history growing out of the Hebrew Bible and the rabbinic commentaries and teachings about that Bible. Um, and they have a sense of a shared national history, even though that national history isn't actually shared necessarily because they're living all over the globe. Okay? But they think of themselves as one people, and you develop a rich culture, a rich collection of Jewish cultures, I should say, in the plural, because the local Jewish cultures reflected where they were living. If they were in North Africa, they would adopt some of those things, right? If they were living in India and something else. Um, and so you get a geographically diverse group of Jews reflecting local cultures, but also with shared elements globally coming out of the shared religious traditions that are not all practiced in the same way, but based in the same things. Okay? So, because they're all over the globe, that means that most Jews are not white, right? Because they're also blending with the local populations a little bit, and they didn't start out as white, after all, coming from the Middle East. Um, in the US, most Jews appear to be white because in the US, there was a huge immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe, from the Russian Empire, starting in 1880 and lasting until 1921, when the US government decided they didn't want any more Jews and they enacted immigration policies that made it hard for them to come in. But about 3 to 4 million Jews ended up in the US during that period. And so most of the Jews that you know in the US are descended from that group, and therefore appear white. But globally, that's not the case. And in Israel, about 70% of the Jews living in Israel today, if they lived in the US and were judged by our standards of race and color, they would be considered people of color. Okay? They're mostly from North Africa and the Middle East, from South America, from India, and so on. Uh, Even in America, by the way, about 8 to 15% of Jews in America are Jews of color. The percentage varies because it depends how you ask the question. Okay, but 8 to 15%. Um, so it's a sense of peoplehood that really defines Jewishness. It's tribal. Going back to those early tribal origins, there's a sense of an extended family. Um, uh, and so it's an ethno-cultural identity, a kind of nation without borders until the state of Israel was established in 1948. And then you could say that there was also a kind of national border, although only about half of the world's Jews, which is just over half of the world's Jews, now live in Israel. Uh, and the rest live elsewhere, mostly in the US. Um, and this ethno-cultural identity was assumed by Jews and non-Jews alike as being the defining characteristic of Jews up until the 1700s. And it was only starting in the 18th century that Jewishness began to be defined as being primarily a religion. And the reasons for that are complicated. It had to do with European politics and European nationalism, where they wanted everybody to identify as French, or everybody to identify as primarily German. And if the Jews were a different national identity, that was a problem. But you could have your Catholics and you could have your Lutherans and you could have your Presbyterians, but they could all be part of, the British culture or whatever. And so therefore Jews, if they were going to fit in, they also had to be just a religion and give up their national identity. Okay? But that's historically an aberration. Today, the vast majority of Jews think of themselves as a distinct ethno-cultural group. For some Jews, but by no means all, there is also a religious identity and religious practices associated with that identity. All practices are not all the same. But almost all Jews think of themselves as also having an ethno-cultural identity. I'm culturally Jewish, they will say. In the US, about 30% of Jews living in the US think of themselves to be cultural Jews only and not religious. And the younger you go, the more likely you are to say that you are a cultural Jew and not a religious Jew. Even those who say they have a religious identity, often they don't practice that religious identity very often. They go to the synagogue once or twice a year on high holidays, and the rest of the time they're not doing very much. Okay? Yeah. Right.
Overall, just in general,
Religiosity has gone down, although for the sociologists say that it's going actually back up. There are a lot of reasons for that. One of that is that people are hungry for community, right? It's one of the things that the Rotary Club helps create. And that's also another thing that churches and synagogues and mosques and other religious organizations create. So that number is actually going up a little bit. So what then is the Center for Jewish Studies that I direct, and what do? We study all of that. Everything that I just told you about and all of its combinations and permutations and complications, that's what we study. And we have classes at the University of Minnesota. Most of the students who take our classes are not Jewish. The number of Jews taking our classes has gone up since 2016 with the rise of anti-Semitism, because these Jewish kids think, well, if I'm going to be attacked for my identity, maybe I ought to know something about it. And so it used to be that in my intro course, out of 40 students, I'd only have maybe 5 or 6 Jewish kids. Now it's about half of the class. So that's gone up. We have a major and a minor for people who want to gain expertise in it. And we engage in educational outreach activities on campus. Coming to groups like this, we run an annual lecture series. You can find information on our lectures on our website, and everyone's invited. And so we have an educational mission on campus and off. That educational mission has become more important, I think, in recent years because of the rise in anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism grows out of misperceptions about Jews and misattributions about Jewish identity and about Jewish behavior. Um, and there are some people you're never going to convince, right? Don't bother talking to them. That 12% of hardcore anti-Semites, forget them. I'm not going to convince them. But that new 12% that didn't used to hold on to these beliefs, they've learned these beliefs because the internet is a cesspool of anti-Semitism. They've learned these beliefs because there are certain politicians in office, especially at the federal level, that are encouraging these kinds of beliefs. And those kinds of people, they can be educated to a different place. And then there's the vast majority of the population that just doesn't know. They hear stuff, they read stuff on the internet, but they don't know if it's true. And if we can intervene educationally, we can prevent them from crossing that line. Uh, so anti-Semitism on campus mirrors the baseline in the overall population, right? Why should kids be different from the places where they grow up? But it's also increasing on campus because of anti-Zionism, anti-Israel sentiment. Recently, that's tied very much to the war between Israel and Gaza after the Hamas massacre of 2023. Because a lot of people want to criticize Israel's actions, and there are lots of reasons for legitimately criticizing Israel's actions, just as there's legitimate reasons for criticizing every government's actions. but they do that criticism using anti-Semitic tropes, right? The soup of anti-Semitism that is Western culture and now global culture, they pull those ideas out. So if one of the anti-Semitic tropes is that Jews have too much power, that gets mapped onto, well, Israel has too much power, right? Or the Jews are clannish and they're responsible for everything, and therefore a Jew in America who actually does not control Israeli policy and doesn't vote for anybody in Israel, but they get blamed. And so now it has become acceptable to say things on campus and elsewhere like kill the Zionists, by which they mean kill the Jews. Because where do they put this kill the Zionists? They put it on synagogues. Okay? They put it on Jewish places